He was already old and blind when they told him his horse had been sold to strangers 3 decades ago. He accepted the grief and let the silence fill the empty barn. Then one ordinary morning, a sound reached him through the open window, a slow, familiar clip-clop on the gravel path. His hands began to tremble. His sightless eyes opened wide. What happened when he stepped onto the porch broke everyone watching. This is Samuel Crawford. He went blind at 52. By 65, he also lost the last creature that knew his voice. A horse called Thunder sold away. For 30 years, the silence held. What you just witnessed is real, and it forces a question that overturns everything we think about memory and loss. How did this animal beat 3 decades to find him? The answer started with a promise made long before the darkness fell. The promise was made in 1962, long before age hollowed out Samuel Crawford's bones and glaucoma stole the light. He was a young horseman then, working a cattle ranch in northern Montana, and the colt was a raw-boned 2-year-old with a coat the color of a storm cloud. Samuel named him Thunder because his gallop shook the dry earth. They were inseparable for 12 years. Samuel could whisper his name across a 100-acre pasture, and Thunder would lift his head, ears pricked, and come running. Those who witnessed it said the animal recognized his voice the way a child knows its mother. That bond, rooted in something science still cannot fully explain, became the tether that held Samuel together when everything else fell apart. The first blow landed in 1974. Samuel was 49 years old and spending his days breaking colts and mending fences. His vision had been blurring for months, but he dismissed it as exhaustion. A visit to a specialist in Billings delivered a diagnosis that crushed him: advanced pigmentary glaucoma, aggressive and irreversible. The doctor gave him perhaps 3 years before total darkness. Samuel drove home in silence, parked his truck beside the barn, and pressed his forehead against Thunder's warm neck until the shaking stopped. He made a quiet agreement that night. As long as his voice could reach the animal, he would not yield to despair. But the ranch was bleeding money, and the medical bills piled up faster than cattle prices could cover. By 1977, when the world became a permanent gray haze and then a total black curtain, the bank began foreclosure proceedings. Samuel's wife, Elena, had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving him alone in the farmhouse with only the horse and a dwindling hope. His grown children, scattered to coastal cities, urged him to sell the land and move into assisted living. Samuel refused. He would keep Thunder, he said, even if the roof leaked and the cupboards grew bare. But his daughter, June, saw the numbers differently. She saw her father stumbling into fences, missing mouthfuls of food, subsisting on neighborly charity, and she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the winter of 1984, while Samuel was bedridden with pneumonia, June arranged for Thunder to be sold to a buyer 3 states away. She told her father the horse had been taken to a sanctuary where he could live out his days in safety. Samuel screamed into the darkness for weeks. He stopped eating. He stopped speaking. Then slowly, he began talking to the empty stall, rehearsing the same words he had promised the young horse decades earlier. "I'll find you again, even if I cannot see your face." He was 56 years old and fully blind, with nothing left but a voice that echoed off rotting barn wood. The years that followed were a slow erosion. Samuel learned to navigate by touch and memory, counting footfalls from the porch to the mailbox, tracing the grooves in the kitchen table that Elena's knife had scarred long ago. The ranch fell into ruin around him. June visited monthly, her guilt thickening with every glimpse of her father's hollowed frame. She noticed something peculiar, though. Samuel never stopped listening. He would sit on the porch for hours, head tilted toward the road, as if waiting for a particular sound that only he could recognize. Neighbors dismissed it as senility. June feared it was something far more stubborn. But here is the thing that transforms a sad story into something extraordinary. Horses possess a memory architecture that scientists have only begun to understand. In 2016, researchers at the University of Sussex demonstrated that horses could recognize photographs of their former caretakers after more than a decade of separation, showing measurable increases in heart rate and prolonged gaze. A separate study in France found that horses could recall distinct human voices for years, even distinguishing between positive and negative past interactions. The bond between Samuel and Thunder was not simply sentimental. It was encoded in neural pathways that time could erode but not erase. And as researchers quietly revised their assumptions about equine cognition, a series of events began to unfold that would test every theory to its breaking point. On the other side of the country, a horse rescue organization in Oregon received an anonymous tip about a neglected gray gelding found wandering on a foreclosed property. The animal was emaciated, covered in rain rot, and bore a faded brand that none of the volunteers recognized at first. A young veterinarian named Amanda Torres performed the intake examination, scanning the horse's microchip with a handheld reader, the number linked to a long-dormant registration file. She cross-referenced it with old paper records at the county agricultural office, working late into the night because something about the animal's behavior intrigued her. Whenever a male volunteer with a deep voice passed his stall, the horse would snap to attention, trembling, nickering frantically, scanning the doorway with a focus that bordered on desperate. Amanda traced the ownership chain back 30 years, through multiple sales and neglect cases, until she found a name: Samuel Crawford. And an address on a crumbling ranch in Montana. Amanda called June Crawford 13 times before she answered. June listened, incredulous, as the veterinarian described a gray horse with a faint star-shaped scar on his left shoulder. The same scar Thunder got as a colt, caught on barbed wire. June's breath caught. She knew what she had to tell her father, and she also knew what it might cost him if this turned out to be false hope. She decided to drive to Oregon first, alone, to confirm the identification. If the horse truly was Thunder, now 34 years old and frail, she would bring the news home herself. But she would not bring the horse. Not yet, because the reunion could kill them both. The blind old man whose heart was too fragile for shock, and the animal who had been traded through so many hands that his trust was shattered beyond repair. She arrived at the rescue on the 1st of September. The moment she stepped into the barn aisle, a guttural nicker erupted from the farthest stall. It was a sound she had not heard since childhood, a sound that bypassed her brain and clutched her spine. She walked forward, trembling, and saw the face. Gray now, hollow-cheeked, but unmistakably Thunder. The horse lowered his head, nostrils flaring, breathing her in with a desperate intensity. He knew. And in that instant, June realized she was holding a fire that could either warm her father's final years or burn everything down. But here, what June didn't know. While she stood weeping into a horse's mane in Oregon, Samuel was already sitting on his porch, 800 miles away, with his head cocked toward the road. He had told a neighbor the day before that he felt something shifting, a dream he couldn't quite recall, a name rising up from the dark. The neighbor dismissed it as old man's fancy. He was wrong. The phone inside the farmhouse began to ring, and nobody answered, because Samuel was already listening to a different sound, still distant, still faint, but drawing closer with every passing hour. The 30-year silence was about to break. The phone inside the farmhouse rang 12 times before June gave up and called the neighbor, a retired electrician named Dale who checked on Samuel every evening. Dale found the old man exactly where he had been for hours, on the porch, sightless eyes wide open, jaw tight as if bracing for impact. When Dale asked if he wanted supper, Samuel did not answer. He simply said, "Something coming, tell June I'm ready." Dale thought he meant death. He was wrong. 1,000 miles west, June was loading a 34-year-old horse into a climate-controlled trailer, praying the animal would survive the journey home. The 30-year thread was pulling taut, and the tension threatened to snap every heart in its path. June had sat in her car outside the Oregon Rescue for 2 hours that September morning, clutching a photograph of her father at 30, standing beside a sleek gray colt with one white sock. The animal in the barn had that same sock, same star-shaped scar, same habit of cocking his head to the left when confused. Amanda Torres had run the microchip twice to be sure. The registration file was buried so deep in county archives that it had survived 3 courthouse floods. Every data point aligned, but it was the horse's behavior that erased all doubt. When Amanda played a cassette recording of Samuel's voice, a grainy snippet from a forgotten home video, thunder erupted. He paced, whinnied, pressed his muzzle against the stall bars with enough force to bend the metal. The sound of that voice, captured decades earlier, had triggered something that no amount of neglect could extinguish. But science would later explain why. Horses possess a brain structure called the hippocampus, essential for long-term memory and emotional association. Researchers have found that positive memories with humans are stored alongside olfactory and auditory cues, forming an integrated sensory map. For Thunder, Samuel's voice was not just a sound, it was a key that unlocked an entire landscape of safety and belonging. And the longer a horse lives, the more resilient these connections become. An equine cognition study from the University of Rennes confirmed that even geriatric horses retain recognition memory for caretakers, though their physical responses may slow. Thunder was geriatric in every sense, sway-backed, arthritic, missing 3 molars. Yet when he heard that voice, he behaved like a colt again. That was the hope. That was also the danger, because Samuel was equally fragile. His heart was a patchwork of stents and beta blockers. His lungs carried the rasp of decades of barn dust. The news of Thunder's survival would either revive him or stop his pulse where it had been faltering for years. June consulted a geriatric cardiologist who gave her a blunt warning. A shock of intense joy could be as lethal as a coronary event. She had to dose the revelation carefully, like morphine. No sudden announcements, no surprise appearances. She would have to prepare her father incrementally, planting suggestions, gauging his reactions, while simultaneously organizing a 500-mile transport that would strain a horse already on borrowed time. Amanda agreed to accompany the transport. She stocked the trailer with intravenous fluids, sedatives, and a portable heart monitor adapted from human medicine. The first 200 miles passed without incident. Thunder stood calmly, munching hay, his dark eyes tracking the shifting light through the trailer's ventilation slats. But when they crossed the Idaho border, something shifted. The horse began to stir, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling as if catching a scent that had no business traveling 3 decades. Amanda checked her GPS. They were still hours from Montana. What was he sensing? Perhaps the change in altitude, perhaps the memory of these mountain ranges embedded in a younger brain. Horses possess a remarkable spatial memory, capable of navigating complex routes years after initial exposure. If anyone had asked Amanda what she believed, she would have said Thunder knew he was going home. But she was a scientist, and she kept that thought to herself. Back at the ranch, Samuel had refused to leave the porch for 2 days. June had called him from the road, her voice carefully casual. "Dad, I'm bringing something for you, something old. I think you'll recognize it." Samuel did not ask questions. He simply sat, his face turned toward the horizon he could not see, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been the same promise he had whispered into an empty stall for 30 years. The wind carried the scent of dried grass and approaching autumn. And then, on the morning of September 3rd, the distant rumble of a diesel engine broke the prairie silence. Samuel's hands gripped the armrests of his rocking chair. He was trembling, but his voice was steady when he called out to Dale, who had been keeping vigil. "It's here." The trailer turned onto the gravel lane, crunching slowly, flanked by June's sedan and a volunteer escort. June climbed out first, her face taut with exhaustion and desperate hope. She walked to the porch and knelt before her father, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Daddy, I need you to listen to me. I lied to you 30 years ago. Thunder wasn't sent to a sanctuary. I sold him, and I have spent my entire life trying to undo what I did. He's here. He's old and he's weak, but he came all this way. Can you hear him?" The ramp lowered, and a sound Samuel had replayed in his mind every single night since 1984 rolled across the dry Montana earth. A low, shuddering nicker, cracked with age, but unmistakably his horse. Samuel rose from the chair, unsteady, arms outstretched into the blinding dark. "Thunder," he whispered, and the name was swallowed by the wind. The horse, led carefully by Amanda, stepped onto the grass and froze. For one terrible second, nothing happened. The blind man and the gray gelding stood 10 feet apart, separated by 3 decades of loss, and the silence stretched so thin that everyone present stopped breathing. Then Thunder took a step forward and collapsed. His front legs buckled as if the weight of the moment had crushed him. Amanda screamed for the emergency kit. June tried to catch Samuel as he stumbled forward, moaning. The animal lay on his side, flanks heaving, eyes rolling white. Samuel, guided only by the sound of struggle, dropped to his knees and crawled toward the labored breathing, his hands finding warm hide and coarse mane. The reunion that was supposed to deliver a miracle had become a medical crisis unfolding in real time. And what happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether this was a story of impossible hope or unbearable tragedy. Amanda Torres dropped to her knees beside the fallen horse, her emergency training overriding panic. She tore open the crash kit, epinephrine, intravenous fluids, a portable defibrillator designed for large animals. Thunder's pulse was thready, his mucous membranes pale gray. She suspected distributive shock brought on by the extreme emotional stress of the moment. An animal that old, pushed to the limits of recognition, could simply shut down. Samuel was still crawling forward, his hands tracing the horse's neck, his voice repeating Thunder's name like an incantation. June stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, watching the 2 most important creatures in her father's life share what she believed would be their final breaths. But horses are prey animals. Their biology is built to override collapse with one last surge of survival. As Amanda inserted an IV line into Thunder's jugular vein, the gelding's eyes rolled back into focus. His legs kicked against the dirt, and with a groan that seemed to emerge from the very core of the earth, he hauled himself upright. Samuel, still on his knees, felt the massive body rise beside him and reached out. His trembling fingers found Thunder's muzzle, tracing the soft skin, the bristled whiskers, the indentation of an old scar from a halter rubbed raw during some forgotten transport. Thunder lowered his head and exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that ruffled Samuel's white hair. The blind man laughed through his tears. "You're still here," he whispered. "You're still my boy." The reunion lasted 3 minutes before Amanda ordered rest. Both man and horse needed medical monitoring. Samuel's pulse was dangerously irregular, and his blood pressure had spiked. Thunder was given a sedative to prevent a repeat collapse. They were separated by a short fence, only so Amanda could run diagnostics on one without startling the other. But even with a wooden rail between them, Thunder kept his muzzle pointed toward Samuel's scent, and Samuel kept one hand resting on the rough timber, as if the wood were a promise he would soon cross again. In the days that followed, the ranch transformed into something none of the neighbors had ever seen. Amanda stayed, sleeping in a spare room. She brought in a colleague from the University of Montana's veterinary program, Dr. Paul Keller, a specialist in geriatric equine cognition. He had spent his career studying how old horses remember, and when he heard the preliminary details, he drove through the night to witness the case firsthand. Dr. Keller brought with him a portable electroencephalogram, the same kind used on high-value racehorses recovering from neurological injury. He wanted to record Thunder's brain activity while the horse interacted with Samuel, to measure whether this reunion was triggering the same neural pathways associated with memory retrieval in humans. What he found would later be published in a peer-reviewed journal, but that's not the part that matters now. The part that matters now is what he discovered when he began cross-referencing Thunder's microchip data with Samuel's old ranch logs. Because Samuel had been a meticulous record keeper before his sight failed, in a dusty barn cabinet, Dr. Keller found 30 years of journal entries, each one dated and written in Samuel's large, looping script. Some entries were practical, feeding schedules, hoof trimming notes, veterinary records, but most were not. Most were letters to Thunder. Page after page, Samuel had documented conversations with an empty stall, telling the horse about his day, about Alina, about the grandchildren he had never met. He described the sounds of the seasons, the way the wind changed, the birds that returned each spring. And then, in an entry dated 1991, Dr. Keller found something that made him set down his coffee and call June into the room. The entry read, "Thunder, I know you can still hear me. I don't know where you are, but I feel you breathing somewhere on this earth. When I die, I want you to know I never stopped listening for your hooves on the gravel. I'd know them anywhere. I'd know your nicker, even if it had to cross an ocean. I've put up a sign on the gate. It says, 'Thunder, come home.' I know you can't read, but maybe someone will." Dr. Keller looked up at June. "Did you ever see a sign on the gate?" he asked. June shook her head, bewildered. The gate had been replaced in 2005 after a storm. But Samuel, blind and stubborn, had never stopped believing that his message would reach the horse. And now, standing in the doorway of the barn, she realized with a chilling clarity that it had. Not through telepathy, not through magic, but through the impossible geometry of memory and distance. Somewhere along the long chain of Thunder's ownership, someone had seen that old sign before it was torn down, or had heard the story from a neighbor, or had simply felt compelled to do the right thing. The anonymous tip that had sent Amanda to that foreclosed property in Oregon. It had come from a man who had bought Thunder at auction 8 years earlier and had kept him in a field for a season before losing his own farm. He gave a name when the rescue pressed him: Harold Mitchell. Yes, the same Harold Mitchell who, at 73, had paid $40 for a dying pregnant mare named Grace. The same Harold who had built an entire sanctuary around the belief that no creature was beyond saving. He had acquired Thunder in a package deal of unwanted horses and had recognized something in the old horse's eyes, a watchfulness, a waiting. He had tracked down the microchip, found the old registration, and made the call. He had been the first link in a chain of compassion that stretched across a continent, and he never told a soul because he believed the reunion should be private, a gift between a man and his horse, not a spectacle for the world. But the world was about to find out. A volunteer at the Oregon Rescue had posted a brief, tearful video of the transport trailer pulling away with the words 30 years lost and he's going home. That video, uploaded to a small farming forum, was shared 50,000 times in the first day. By the end of the week, national news outlets were calling June's phone. The story of the blind old man and his returned horse had gone viral, and with that visibility came both opportunity and peril. Offers of money poured in, requests for interviews, and a letter from a law firm representing a former owner who claimed Thunder was stolen property, demanding the horse be returned or compensation be paid. The miracle was becoming a crisis, and Samuel, still fragile, still perched on the edge of a damaged heart, would have to decide whether to fight or to let go all over again. Samuel received the legal threat on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked deeply uncomfortable standing on the porch of a blind man surrounded by news crews. June read the letter aloud, her voice trembling with fury. A man named Darren Kleinfeld, who had owned Thunder for 7 months in 2009 and then abandoned him on a foreclosed property, now claimed he had never transferred ownership and that the horse was his property. The letter demanded $150,000 in restitution or the immediate return of the animal. Samuel listened, motionless, his sightless eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. When June finished, he asked one question: "Does Thunder have any memory of this man?" Dr. Keller, who had been monitoring the horse's neurological responses for over a week, answered quietly, "No." His stress indicators spike around unfamiliar male voices with a certain pitch, "but not yours. Never yours." That single piece of data became the cornerstone of the defense. June, with the help of a pro bono animal rights attorney named Rebecca Okonkwo, filed a countersuit asserting that Thunder had been abandoned, not stolen, and that the previous owner had forfeited all rights through neglect. Rebecca deposed Kleinfeld, and in a moment of courtroom drama that would later be excerpted in legal textbooks, she played the EEG recordings of Thunder's brain activity when exposed to recordings of various voices. Kleinfeld's voice registered a stress spike consistent with fear. Samuel's voice triggered a parasympathetic response consistent with deep calm. The horse, in effect, had testified. The judge dismissed the claim with prejudice and issued a blistering opinion that ended with a line reporters seized upon: "The heart remembers what the law sometimes forgets." With the legal storm past, the media frenzy subsided into something gentler. Networks that had wanted dramatic confrontations now wanted quiet moments. A documentary crew arrived from the BBC. They filmed Samuel sitting on his porch, Thunder grazing nearby, the two of them existing in a rhythm that felt preordained. Samuel, who had once retreated into silence, now talked freely about the decades of waiting. He described the sensation of hearing Thunder's hoofbeats for the first time, a sound that had cut through 30 years of darkness like a blade of light. He said the moment reminded him of something Alina had told him before she died: that love is a frequency, and the universe never truly loses a signal it has once transmitted. The documentary aired 8 months later and won awards. But more importantly, it reached a man in Kansas who had been sitting on a similar guilt for 20 years. He called the number at the end of the film and asked if Grace's Haven could take his old mare, a horse he had neglected out of depression and shame. The ripple kept spreading. Harold Mitchell finally visited the Montana ranch in early spring, driving himself in a pickup truck with a bumper sticker that read "Grace's Haven, every life counts." He was 74 now, walking with a cane, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He sat with Samuel on the porch, and the two old men talked for hours about the animals that had saved them. Harold described Grace, the miracle triplet foals, the sanctuary that had grown from a single act of stubborn compassion. Samuel described Thunder's return, the journal, the sign on the gate that had become a prophecy. And then Harold revealed something that made Samuel sit forward in his chair. The anonymous tip that had led Amanda to that foreclosed property in Oregon had not come from Harold alone. It had come from a woman named Christine, the same Christine who had been reunited with her own horse, Flynn, at Red Wings Sanctuary in England. She had seen Harold's name in a rescue newsletter and had written him a letter saying she had a feeling about an old grey gelding she'd seen on a deplorable farm while visiting a relative in Oregon. She asked Harold to check. That letter, a single page written in shaky cursive, had set the entire chain in motion. Samuel listened, his face wet with tears, and whispered, "Tell her thank you. Tell her she brought my boy home." But there was one more surprise waiting, buried in the barn's dust and shadows. During a final deep cleaning of the loft, June discovered a second journal that Samuel had forgotten, one from the year before he went blind. In it, he had written a detailed description of a dream he had after Elena's funeral. The dream was of an old man, blind, standing in a field while a grey horse walked toward him out of a fog. The man reached out, and the horse pressed his forehead into the man's chest. The dream ended with a voice, Elena's voice, saying, "You will know him by the sound of his breathing." At the bottom of the page, Samuel had written a single line, "I don't know if this is prophecy or grief, but I'm going to hold on to it." That journal entry, dated 47 years ago, was now laminated and framed on the wall of the barn next to Thunder's halter. Every visitor who read it understood at once. The story they were witnessing had been written long before any of the participants knew they were actors in it. The bond between Samuel and Thunder deepened into a quiet symbiosis. The horse, now fully recovered from his transport trauma, had become Samuel's eyes in ways no one anticipated. Dr. Keller documented instances where Thunder would position himself between Samuel and an obstacle, or guide him back to the porch when the old man wandered too far. The horse had learned to adjust his pace to Samuel's shuffling steps, and Samuel had learned to read Thunder's breathing like a language. They communicated in a vocabulary older than words, and the neighbors who had once pitied Samuel now came to him for advice on their own troubled animals. He had become, in his final years, a kind of local sage, a living testament to the endurance of connection. The final image of this story is not the reunion itself, but a morning 2 years later. Samuel is 93, Thunder is 36, ancient by equine standards, his grey coat now white, his movements slow but still purposeful. They stand together in the pasture as the sun rises, the old man's hand resting on the horse's shoulder, his face turned toward the warmth he can feel but not see. A photographer from a nature magazine captures the image and asks Samuel what he is thinking. Samuel replies without hesitation, "I'm thinking that I kept my promise. I told him I'd find him again, even if I couldn't see his face. And I did. We are both still here. That's the whole miracle." The photographer lowers his camera, weeping, and later writes that he had never witnessed such a complete circle of love in his entire career. But the story is not quite finished, because the legacy of that promise would soon outgrow any one man or one horse. That legacy now lives in every rescue adoption, in every person who refuses to believe an animal is beyond hope. Samuel passed quietly in his sleep 2 winters after that photograph was taken, with Thunder standing vigil outside his window. Thunder followed him 18 months later, the vet said, from an age that had simply reached its limit. They are buried side by side on the ranch, beneath a stone that reads, "The voice and the hoofbeat, finally together." But the story refuses to end there. Across 3 continents, people who watched the documentary began tracking down animals they had once given up on. A woman in Australia reunited with a dog after 11 years. A former soldier in Texas found his retired service horse. The question that Dr. Keller still asks is the same one science cannot fully answer. How much of the heart is stored in memory, and how much is stored in something else entirely? Something that a blind man on a porch in Montana understood better than any laboratory. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to believe that no bond is ever truly lost. We'll keep telling the ones that prove it.